Thank you all for joining us for this IAA member briefing. We certainly have a lot to talk about. We're well into the first year of the Biden administration, and our regulators have new leadership with expansive new agendas. Congress is actively considering tax and retirement changes that could have a big impact on your firms and clients. The COVID pandemic is still with us, and the sands seem to be shifting pretty much constantly on that. Each day, we are reminded of the threats of climate change with extreme weather events, and we're continuing to address how our profession can be part of meaningful change. These developments are at the center of policy efforts and driving the IAA's activities. We'll touch on all of them and more this afternoon. I'm joined by our MC and moderator, Gail Bernstein, our excellent general counsel, as well as by Neil Simon, our influential vice president of government relations, and the IAA's expert legal team, Monique Botkin, Sarah Busher, Laura Grossman, and Sanjay Lamba. I will start us off with pandemic-related issues, as well as our diversity and inclusion initiative. Neil will follow with some of the IAA's other policy priorities and what's new on Capitol Hill, which is a lot. Gail and her team will cover the regulatory landscape, including the SEC's agenda under Chair Gary Gensler. They will also discuss developments at the Department of Labor and the Federal Trade Commission, and of course, our advocacy on your behalf. So let's start with the continuing impacts of the pandemic. It's been about 18 months since the pandemic hit the US, and you have all done an exceptional job of handling this crisis. You've stayed nimble, and of course, you've continued to act as valued fiduciaries to your clients at a time where they really need your help. That said, the pandemic has brought with it new and ongoing challenges for all of us, both professional and personal. In addition to the operational, HR, compliance, and regulatory challenges, firms have had to deal with personnel dealing with their childcare, with their parents, with themselves or their family members becoming ill, and the Delta variant developments are continuing to present significant challenges. The IAA has held regular member calls throughout this period for all of you to share your experiences with one another. And in fact, we have another one tomorrow. Please join us. We have facilitated discussions about the different approaches to return to work, the future of the office, vaccinations and testing, employee morale and equity, and of course, issues around compliance and supervision. We've been in frequent contact with the regulators over the past year and a half as members have brought concerns to our attention. And we've obtained meaningful relief to help all of you adjust more easily to this new reality. We are continuing to advocate to extend the relief where appropriate and make some changes permanent, including with respect to, for example, e-delivery. We've also developed and created significant resources on our website to help you through these challenges. If you haven't checked out these resources, I encourage you to look at our webpage. As we all know, the situation is still evolving, and we're all being called upon to react quickly and thoughtfully. The IA is here for you, and please don't hesitate to reach out if we can be of any assistance. We've also been providing support for efforts around diversity and inclusion and helping to promote a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive industry, both from a policy perspective and from a practical perspective. For example, we have supported legislation that would permit the SECs and other regulators' offices of minority and women inclusion to collect demographic data on larger investment management firms. Measuring progress is critically important to making progress. We also anticipate that the SEC will address issues around human capital as part of its environmental, social, and government, or ESG, initiatives, and we look forward to working with them. Our DEI working group has developed a practical guide to assist members in building DEI at their firms. It is on our DEI resource page, along with a study that we conducted with Cerulli on barriers faced by diverse candidates in our industry. It also has video presentations, external resources, and more. Our working group is also developing resources on recruitment, including outreach to colleges and developing a speaker series. I encourage you to join us. Just get in touch with me if you'd like to participate. This is clearly a long-term effort, and there's a lot more that's been going on in the investment advisor space. Before I turn it over to Gail, I want to urge all of you to sign up for our leadership conference next week, September 29 to October 1. Like all of you, we've had to be nimble and convert our conference to a virtual format. We have a terrific lineup on important topics, including the economic outlook, lessons from a leading pandemic expert, sustainable investing, active passive, the future of work, M&A, digital assets, and much more. And we have the same small group breakout sessions that all of you enjoy so much at the Leadership Conference. So please join us. With that, over to Gail.
Great, thank you, Karen. The Biden administration certainly has an ambitious agenda, so we have a lot to cover today. As we go through each of the agenda items, we will try to weave in trends and themes that we're seeing and provide what we think are the most important takeaways for advisors. Unfortunately, I've been struggling with some laryngitis, so I am going to lean on the rest of the amazing IAA team to do the heavy lifting today. So why don't we start with Neil to provide a brief update on what's new in the IAA's policy priorities, and then turn to activity on the Hill. Neil?
Thank you, Gail. You see in front of you a list of IAA's 2021 policy priorities. These are just the headings. The document itself is actually 2 pages, and I commend it to your reading. This is a living document. It reflects certain bedrock principles, for instance, the importance of SEC primacy and investment advisor regulation, fiduciary standard, and the like. But it is constantly being updated based on the input we get from our members, from members of our Government Relations Committee, our Legal and Regulatory Committee. Please comment, join these committees. We could use your help. And you can review the policy priorities on our website. It's prominently featured on our advocacy pages. Okay, let's move to Congress, and it's not necessarily a pretty picture. As Betty Davis would have said, fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy ride. We are now in a 3-week legislative sprint as Congress and this nation are facing 3 critical economic guidelines. Government funding, we're reaching the end of the fiscal year. The debt ceiling, certainly you have read about that, and the vote on Biden's economic agenda. Just today, Pelosi and the Democratic leadership introduced a stopgap funding bill, which would essentially involve a continuing resolution that would extend government funding through December 3rd. It would also suspend our hitting the debt limit ceiling until December 16th. However, Republicans are not going along with this and are trying to use the debt ceiling to gain leverage on the $3.5 trillion spending plan. How is this going to play out? Well, I sure wish I could tell you. Could we be facing some sort of partisan train wreck involving the full faith and credit of the United States, as well as a government shutdown? Certainly it's possible, but I'm betting against it. But there's lots and lots of uncertainty. Meanwhile, the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax writing committee in the House of Representatives, introduced just last week its proposal. And this gets a little bit more granular in terms of how money would be spent as well as revenue. And in fact, the Ways and Means Committee proposal includes $2 trillion of revenue raising measures, which could be used as pay-fors. That's a term you hear a lot in Washington, D.C., pay-fors. And this would offset much of the $3.5 trillion spending plan if that advances. And much of the revenue raising measures that have been proposed are aimed at you. They're aimed at high net worth taxpayers, and that's perhaps you, and certainly I hope many of your clients. And it includes a lot of high income retirement savers. So for instance, there are proposed restrictions on IRA investments. There are limits on Roth IRAs. These are all matters that you need to stay on top of, and please stay in touch with IA on this as we put out information on it. But there are also other provisions that are being bandied about on Capitol Hill and are embodied in the Ways and Means proposal. The tax treatment of in-kind redemptions of ETFs, a really big issue that has cropped up and we are now getting involved with, along with other financial service trade associations in Washington. Carried interest, extending the holding period that would be applicable to 3 to 5 years. This is terribly consequential. And of course, we have state and local taxes, estate taxes, and the like. But let me just focus down a little bit more on some of the issues that we continue to work on your behalf. And we're looking at slide 8 here on congressional matters. First off, I want to mention pass-through deduction. This was something that was created in 2017 as part of the Tax Cuts Act for owners of businesses that were organized as pass-throughs, so-called Section 199A of the Internal Revenue Code. Unfortunately, a broad swath of service providers, including owners of advisory firms, were not deemed eligible for this pass-through deduction, and we are trying to fix that. In fact, along with some other interested parties, we sent a letter to the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, which is the Senate's tax writing committee, Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, just last week, specifically about the pass-through deduction and making advisors eligible for it. Do we have a shot at it? Yes. Is it a long shot? Sure, I'll admit that, but it's an important issue. Secondly, an issue that we've talked about before has to do with the deductibility of advisory fees. As you know, or as your clients are aware, there was limited deductibility of advisory fees prior to the 2017 Tax Cuts Act. We not only are seeking to restore that provision, but expand it so that advisory fees can be deductible by all taxpayers, not just those that are very high net worth as existed before 2017. And then finally, I should mention that retirement savings. We had the so-called Secure Act was passed in the last Congress. We were optimistic there was going to be more legislative activity. That has not happened. But there is a Secure Act 2.0 floating around that we are very supportive of. It would get far more taxpayers involved in retirement savings plans, with new auto enrollment features and the like, new provisions on catch-up provisions for IRAs, RMDs, and the like. What could happen? Well, it's possible that the powers that be will try to slip this so-called Secure Act 2.0 in the massive $3.5 trillion reconciliation package. That is something we are supporting. As you know, IAA has long supported efforts to help Americans save for retirement, and you as investment advisors have a terribly important role to play there. So please stay tuned. Let me just touch on some of the other things on this slide very, very quickly. Diversity, equity, inclusion, Karen already discussed. We're supporting a bill, it's called HR 2123, that would allow financial regulators at the SEC and elsewhere to require that regulated entities that have more than 100 employees respond to the surveys that are sent out by their respective offices of minority and women inclusion, referred to as OMWI. We need this foundational data so we can measure the improvements that we all are committed to making in this important area. Cybersecurity, privacy, terribly important. This is important to you, as well as the occupants of the C-suites at your firms. We know it. And I must say that there does seem to be some progress, at least on data breach notification in Congress. But there are an awful lot of committees involved. There are a lot of cooks involved in this one. But there is renewed attention by Congress. Again, I can't predict the outcome, but we're there for you. Let me just talk quickly about grassroots advocacy, because in fact, it's your involvement. You're the guys that are employing people, that are paying taxes, that are voting, I hope. And it is when you get involved in the issues that we're talking about and make your feelings known, that the issues that we, the message that we deliver from IAA to Capitol Hill, they resonate. So grassroots advocacy is just terribly important. We have had our Advisor Advocacy Day. This year's was a virtual event. I am hoping that next year's will be in person. It is scheduled for June 9th. I expect it to be a lovely day in your nation's capital, and I sure hope that you can come and participate in that program. And then finally, take action now. In every way, but also we regularly send out notices to all of our members about what's going on Capitol Hill and how you can impact that by using the Take Action Now feature on our website. It makes it very simple for you to send a message to your legislators that represent you. So please do respond to that. I expect we're going to be getting one out at the end of the week on retirement savings and the importance of including it in the activity that is going on with the budget, but please pay attention. So I apologize for going so long, but back to you, Gail.
Thank you, Neil, for that whirlwind tour of what's going on the Hill. Let's switch gears now and turn to the regulatory landscape. Laura, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and let's start with the SEC. Gary Gensler has been the SEC chair since April, and we now have a full complement of commissioners, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, which signals a dramatic shift in priorities. Gensler is no stranger to taking on big issues, which we learned when he headed up the CFTC following adoption of the Dodd-Frank Act. As we have done with past new leadership of the SEC, the IAA put together a comprehensive letter welcoming the new chair and laying out our regulatory priorities for the advisor industry. We also met with Chair Gensler early in his tenure and had an extremely productive back and forth on areas of importance to our members. The chair is familiar with the IAA and our members from his time at the CFTC, but he's now in a position to view advisors through a different lens, and it's important for the IAA that we help the regulators understand the depth and breadth of who our members are and what they do. For example, we spent some time in our letter and with the chair talking about the unique challenges that smaller advisory firms face, and we asked that he be particularly attentive to the cumulative impact of regulatory action on these small businesses and the public that they serve. We discussed the standards of conduct package adopted in 2019, which includes Reg BI for broker-dealers, Form CRS, and a fiduciary interpretation. We also stressed our support for policies that facilitate advisors' ability to engage in sustainable investing and that promote the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels of the investment advisor industry. We asked that the SEC ensure that regulation be both technology neutral and strategy neutral, and that regulators take care not to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. Advisors must have the flexibility to consider factors and pursue investment strategies that they determine in their professional judgment best meet their clients' specific goals. Our letter addressed many other technical issues as well, like the custody rule and e-delivery. We'll talk about those today also. Many of our priorities align with the chair's. He's also focused on the standards of conduct rulemaking, sustainable investing, DE&I, and technology. In addition, he plans on tackling market structure issues, which will have implications for advisors, and digital assets are also a central agenda item for him. In recent testimony before the Senate Banking Committee, Gensler talked about these topics and also addressed potential reforms the SEC is exploring in the investment management space. These include marketing by funds as green, cybersecurity risk governance, private fund fees and conflicts, and money market and open-end bond fund reform. Sarah will now briefly cover the standards of conduct rulemaking and then turn to others to get into details on some of these other priorities. Sarah?
Thanks, Laura. So early on, there was much talk that the Biden administration would throw out the standard of conduct rulemaking and start over. We do not think that that's the direction that this SEC will go. It's our view that the rulemaking provides a framework for strong investor protective enforcement of financial professional conduct, and that it is not necessary for the SEC to reopen it. Based on recent enforcement cases and agency statements, we think this is also how the SEC currently views it. We predict that the SEC will try to interpret, implement, and enforce Reg BI, Form CRS, and the fiduciary duty interpretation as aggressively as possible, but will not easily reopen the rulemaking, which took around 20 years to get done. As for Form CRS, we've seen several recent enforcement actions, but they've been what I would call the low-hanging fruit cases. They are all against firms that clearly should have filed a form, but did not. The next step will likely be on the merits. The SEC will look at the actual Form CRS disclosures and question whether they are adequate. We're also seeing the SEC use the fiduciary interpretation to hold advisors to highly detailed disclosure of conflicts and best execution obligations. And we think we'll continue to see a focus on the adequacy of advisors' compliance programs. Sanjay will discuss this a bit more later in our briefing. Karen, I'd like to turn it back to you to talk about the SEC's Asset Management Advisory Committee, or AMAC.
Thanks, Sarah. In early 2020, the AMAC was formed to provide the SEC with various perspectives on asset management. AMAC members are from a range of investment advisor and fund firms, including IAA members, as well as market intermediaries and academics. The committee is engaged in several work streams on a range of topics, including ESG, diversity, access to private markets, small advisors and funds, and the evolution of advice. The IAAs had the opportunity to engage with the committee and offer to act as a resource. In fact, Gail and I have been invited to participate on a panel next week, Monday, September 27th, that will address the regulation of smaller advisors and funds. We will discuss the data on smaller advisors from our annual snapshot report on the industry, formerly known as Evolution Revolution, as well as the need to tailor regulation and exam expectation to the size and type of firm, both generally and in specific areas. So we'll touch on cyber, privacy, lack of leverage with vendors, CUSIP and licensing fees, and much more. So stay tuned for that, and back over to you.
Great, thank you, Karen. Let's get into some of the nuts and bolts now of the regulations that are in play. Sanjay, why don't we start with you and the new marketing rule?
Absolutely, thanks, Gail. So according to our annual investment management compliance testing survey, the new SEC marketing rule was a top concern of compliance professionals. I'm not really surprised by this, given that I'm guessing a lot of you are either in the process of or thinking about implementing the new rule by next year's deadline, which is next November. As you probably know by now, the new rule does combine the old advertising rule and the cash solicitation rule and merges it into one, now what they're referring to as the marketing rule. Now I'll talk about the marketing aspects of the rule, and Laura will cover some issues under the solicitation related provisions. Now, just a quick note on compliance. As I mentioned, next November is the deadline. We are in the midst of an 18-month transition period. The SEC staff has come out and confirmed that you can start complying early with the new rule if you'd like, but it is an all or nothing game here. So if you decide you want to comply with the new rule, you have to comply with all provisions of the rule. You can't just pick and choose certain provisions. Now, of course, I don't have a lot of time here to go through all the various provisions of the new marketing rule. We have a dedicated webpage that has a lot of resources on it. I suggest that you take a look at it. They're excellent. But what I do want to do is highlight some of the key aspects of the new rule, including some opportunities that it presents, as well as some potential compliance pitfalls that you should be mindful of. Now the good news is that the new rule improves a lot of issues that the IAA has argued over the years. For example, it no longer contains per se prohibitions that existed under the old rule, and it employs more of a principles-based approach, something, as I said, we've argued for in our comment letter as well as over the years. Another good aspect of it, and most notably, is that the rule removes for the first time the rule will permit the use of client testimonials and endorsements, and most notably, the new rule will finally allow you to be able to reference past specific recommendations in your marketing materials. As you know, the current rule prohibits this flat out. There has been some no action letters that have eased up on it a bit, but for the most part, it's restricted your ability to be able to describe your investment strategies, your philosophy by using specific references. And now you'll be able to do that, provided you give fair and balanced disclosures. So those are some of the positive aspects of the new rule. Now, there are some challenges that you should be thinking about. First and foremost, it's the definition of advertising, which is now fairly long and somewhat complicated. And the new rule also combines the, as I said, the cash solicitation and their advertising rule, so that makes it a little bit more complicated as well. And the new rule also now covers, for the first time, private funds. So there are some issues there, and so I do suggest that you start scoping out what's within the definition of advertising and what's not. The new rule also, for the first time, provides clear guidelines on the use of performance numbers in your marketing materials. Now, this is an area that we've been getting a lot of questions on, and I think there are some issues here that folks will need to work through. Some of the changes here include, for example, you'll have to, for the first time, when you use performance numbers, include 1, 5, and 10-year performance numbers in your marketing materials. The new rule also has a requirement that you provide gross and net of fees, regardless of who you are marketing to. That's a slight change here, so there's some issues here that you'll need to work through. And the new rule also, for the first time, defines and severely restricts the use of hypothetical performance, which now includes targeted and projected performance. Now, there are many other questions relating to the use of, for example, related and composite performance, as well as predecessor performance. So there are some issues here that you'll need to work through. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk about the other provisions of the rule. Laura?
Right, so the new marketing rule will also replace the cash solicitation rule. And it will also cover traditional solicitation activities. In an expansion from the current rule, the new rule will cover cash as well as non-cash compensation provided to solicitors, which will be called promoters under the new rule. The new rule will also include investors in private funds, which is something new. So to start preparing for implementation of this part of the rule, we're suggesting that advisors consider how your current solicitation and referral arrangements and your placement agent agreements might need to be amended. Start identifying indirect compensation that you provide, including non-cash compensation. Try to understand the regulatory status of your promoters because they might have to register as investment advisors under the new regime. And also consider whether you'll be affected by the expansion of the rule to private funds. So there's clearly a lot of things to do to get ready for implementation. To help members, we do have our marketing implementation group that has regular calls. So we invite you to get involved with that group if you're not already on it. And I'll turn it back to Gail.
Great, thank you, Laura. Let's switch gears again. There's a lot of focus at the SEC on ESG, and it is certainly one of the most important issues for advisors and for investors as well. Sarah, can you unpack for us some of what's going on in this area at the SEC? And let's get into the Department of Labor a little bit later.
Yes, thanks, Gail. ESG is definitely a key focus area for the SEC. Earlier this year, Commissioner Lee published a request for input on corporate climate disclosures, and the IAA commented on that request. We strongly believe that the SEC should begin with disclosure requirements for corporate issuers before proposing regulations for advisors and funds. In our letter and in a meeting with Chair Gensler's Climate Council, we discussed our support of consistent, comparable, and reliable disclosures of material information by corporate issuers on climate and other ESG matters. In a speech in late July, Chair Gensler outlined proposals that he has asked the SEC staff to develop for Commission consideration regarding ESG disclosures. He's asked the staff to develop a mandatory climate risk disclosure rule proposal for corporate issuers by the end of this year. Now, regarding third-party standard setters like TCFD and SASB, Gensler said that the staff should learn from and be inspired by them, but he believes that the SEC should write the rules and establish a climate risk disclosure regime. He also discussed fund disclosure, and he's asked the staff to consider whether the SEC should take a holistic look at the fund names rule and whether fund managers should disclose the criteria and underlying data that they use in connection with sustainability-related investing. Now, the Division of Examinations has already issued a risk alert on ESG investing in April, and it describes areas of focus and examinations of advisors and funds engaging in ESG investing, compliance issues in this area, and examples of effective compliance practices. Regarding areas of focus, the SEC is looking at all steps of portfolio management, including processes used to select, invest in, and monitor investments, and whether proxy voting processes are consistent with disclosures and marketing materials. Now, speaking of marketing, that and advertising are another area of focus. For example, if a firm says that it is following a particular ESG framework, the SEC will review the firm's compliance policies, disclosures, and practices in connection with that framework. The SEC noted as an area of weakness situations where firms said that they followed a particular ESG framework, but then the firm's investments did not reflect that. The staff also found inadequate controls related to clients' ESG-related directives. On proxy voting, the staff noted situations where a firm disclosed it would evaluate ESG-related proxy proposals on a case-by-case basis, but then the internal guidelines at the firm did not provide for that. Now, as for effective practices, the SEC noted clear, precise disclosures tailored to a firm's specific ESG approaches that are aligned with the firm's actual practices. This sounds familiar. Do what you say and say what you do. They also discussed having compliance personnel knowledgeable about specific ESG-related practices. If you're engaging in or considering engaging in ESG investing, this risk alert is definitely worth reading. We also now have an ESG committee at the IAA. Just let us know if you'd like to join. Gail?
Thank you, Sarah. As we've done in prior briefings, let's move now to our regulatory round robin, where we will quickly cover some of the specific regulatory initiatives that are on the horizon. We'll also discuss some of the work that the IAA is doing in each of these areas. Laura, let's start with a perennial favorite, the custody rule.
Yes, so the SEC staff is working on recommendations to the Commission on modernizing the custody rule. Given the importance of the rule and the many issues with it, we are actively working on a comment letter because we feel it is important to share our views in advance of any staff recommendations to the Commission. One major change we're going to ask for is that the rule be reconceptualized and rewritten in order to make it less confusing and more workable. We plan to recommend a new framework under which custody in the form of direct possession of client assets is distinguished from access to or authority over client assets. We will suggest renaming the rule the Safeguarding Client Assets Rule. We think this approach would create a more evergreen framework for safeguarding client assets that would adapt as the securities markets change and methods of holding and trading assets continue to evolve. We will also recommend several major revisions to the current rule to make it more workable. Just a couple of examples are eliminating surprise examinations, adding an authorized trading exclusion from the definition of custody, and expanding the privately offered securities exception to make it usable by more advisors. We also recently responded to the SEC staff's request to the IAA for input on investment advisor and custodial trading practices relating to transactions that are processed or settled on a non-delivery versus payment or non-DVP basis. We are working with our custody working group on comments, so we'd love you to get involved if you're not already in that group. And now over to Sanjay.
All right, thanks, Laura. So the SEC just recently, and I literally mean just recently, put out a request for information and public comment on the use of digital engagement practices by broker-dealers and investment advisors. Now, these practices include behavioral prompts, differential marketing, gamification, and other design features that are designed to engage with retail investors on digital platforms. So for example, websites, portals, and related applications. It also includes analytical and technological tools and methods. Now, the SEC is also scrutinizing related conflicts of interest in this space that may arise from such digital engagement practices, and whether those practices are making a recommendation or providing investment advice. And I think perhaps the most notable aspect of the request is that the SEC clearly states that in response to its 78-page request for information, they'll also be assessing whether existing regulations are adequate and considering whether additional rules in this space might be necessary. Now, obviously, this has been a high priority for Chair Gensler, who's expressed concerns about the technology features that may encourage investors to trade more often or invest in products that aren't appropriate for them, or even just change their investment strategy. Now, he is also concerned about some of the issues with respect to predictive analytics, as well as other practices that are designed to really increase revenues, data collection, or just the amount of time that investors spend on platforms. Now, which he's concerned that will lead to conflicts of interest. So we are going to prepare a comment letter, and in our letter we are going to stress that we think that existing rules are good and they do apply to these practices, and that no further regulatory action is needed in this space. And we're also going to continue to stress that regulations should be technology neutral and not based solely on the presence, absence, or the type of technology that's being used. And we're also going to take this opportunity to again stress our position on e-delivery, which is that the SEC should change from a paper-based delivery mechanism to an electronic delivery format, and we think that there are some issues here that are related. So as I said, comments are due by the end of the month, which does not give us a lot of time, which is okay because we have a great group of members on our digital advisory committee that's going to help us with some of the issues. If you're interested in providing feedback to us, please do reach out to me. We don't have a lot of time, so I would welcome your comment. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Monique to talk about private funds and some issues in that area. Monique?
Thanks, Sanjay. The SEC's regulatory agenda includes amendments to Form PF, the non-public reporting form for private fund advisors. Chair Gensler also testified last week that the SEC is considering requiring private fund managers to provide enhanced disclosure of conflicts of interest and fees. He mentioned Form ADV as a potential area for amendments. Now let's turn to private markets. The SEC is expected to propose amendments to update the financial thresholds needed to meet the accredited investor definition. And it also plans to propose amendments to increase information available about private offerings. And the SEC plans to amend the integration framework for registered and exempt offerings, which could include reversing some of the amendments made just last year under the previous administration. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Monique. So now we're going to talk about proxy voting. And the SEC issued guidance to investment advisors on proxy voting in 2019 and 2020 without the opportunity for notice and comment. Excuse me. The 2020 guidance was connected to a 2020 rule that applied to proxy advisory firms. And in that rule, the SEC codified an interpretation from 2019 stating that advice provided by proxy advisory firms was a solicitation under the Exchange Act. In June of this year, Chair Gensler issued a statement directing the staff to consider whether to revisit that rule and the related interpretation from 2019. He did not mention in that statement the guidance for investment advisors, but the 2020 guidance for advisors is connected to the 2020 rule. The SEC's Division of Corporation Finance said that it would not recommend enforcement action against proxy advisory firms, with the SEC considering further regulatory action in that area. The IAA has opposed any steps that would make it more difficult for investment advisors to vote proxies and to use the services of proxy advisory firms. The SEC's regulatory agenda included proxy voting advice in its short-term agenda and amendments to improve the fund proxy system and proxy process as long-term actions. We'll await next steps from the SEC. I'll turn to Laura to discuss Form 13F.
So Chair Gensler has commented that he has asked SEC staff to prepare recommendations to the Commission to expand Form 13F filings to include derivatives and possibly short positions. And on the legislative front, there was a draft bill that would amend Section 13F in this way to expand what's required to be reported to add derivatives and short positions. The bill would also dramatically shorten the timing and increase the frequency of filing Form 13F reports from 45 days after the end of each quarter, which is what we have now, to 5 business days after the end of each month. Although we think it's unlikely that this bill will go anywhere in Congress, never say never, and the SEC could, of course, act in this space, and we wanted you to be aware of this potential development. Switching gears to digital assets, Chair Gensler has been actively talking about his concerns about gaps in regulation of digital assets, even referring to the lack of investor protection as the Wild West, and asking Congress to provide the SEC and other regulators with the authority to write rules and attach guardrails to trading and lending in digital assets. And earlier this year, the SEC's Division of Examinations issued a risk alert that provides a very helpful roadmap for advisors that invest clients in digital assets. It assists firms in developing and enhancing their compliance practices related to digital securities and other distributed ledger assets. The alert also outlines areas of focus for future exams, which will be in the areas of portfolio management, books and records, custody, disclosures, pricing client portfolios, and registration issues. The IAA has a technology innovation committee looking at these issues. Now over to Monique.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm going to talk a little bit about market structure. After record market volatility earlier this year, where some brokers imposed trading restrictions on some stocks, Chair Gensler announced that the SEC is conducting a review of market structure. This includes payment for order flow practices by brokers and the impact on best execution, and shortening the settlement cycle for securities trades from trade date +2 to T+1 or even T+0 or same day settlement. This rule is on the SEC's agenda for the fall, and the staff is actively working on a proposal. It will significantly impact market infrastructure, including around global transactions, allocation and affirmation processes, securities lending and margin, among other areas. Prior to the chair's announcement, the industry, including the buy side, the sell side, and the DTCC, announced in April of this year that they committed to move to T+1 to improve efficiencies and make the market more resilient. The industry groups do oppose a move to T+0 at this point because of complexities and increased risk rather than decreasing the risk. The IAA will continue to get involved and be involved in this initiative, and we encourage member feedback here. Gail, can I turn it back to you?
Yes, thank you, Monique. Let's move to a discussion of how we're seeing some of these themes reflected in enforcement and exam trends. Sanjay, do you want to start with enforcement?
Absolutely. So every year, the SEC's Enforcement Division releases its annual report that describes the detail of the work that it's doing, its focus areas, as well as enforcement priorities. And if I were to guess what we can expect on next year's or this year's annual report, which is probably due out in November, and some of the focus areas that we'd expect to see, and I'll try to highlight some of those. So we went back and we looked at some of the cases over the past year, and out of the roughly 226 enforcement cases that they brought overall, 107 of them involved investment advisors, and about 20 of those cases involved Form CRS, which, as Sarah mentioned, really was sort of low-hanging fruit. They identified firms that should have filed Form CRS but failed to do so, and after being warned about it, did not file. So those were those actions. Protecting retail investors continues to be a top priority for the division, as it has been in recent years, and I expect this trend to continue under the new administration. And looking back, and I think even sort of looking forward, cases involving straight up fraud and theft of money from investors continues to be sort of the main type of cases that they bring. But they do bring cases relating to rule violations. Overall, I do expect the number of enforcement cases to go up this year under the new leadership, but we likely won't notice these trends right away. It does take really a couple of years for cases to make their way up to the commission. So again, looking back at the cases, some other notable findings we found is that the SEC have harsher findings and penalties for firms that were involved in the share class election violations. And I expect the SEC enforcement staff will continue to look at conflicts and disclosure issues involving share class selection, especially given that we've been told that the examination staff continues to see problems in this area. I'll note also they've expanded this inquiry to include revenue sharing, and they've been asking about particularly cash sweep arrangements by investment advisors. And these cases, I think, will also continue to focus and look at best execution. And so this is an area that the SEC is continuing to focus on. Looking forward a bit, I think we'll see an increased focus on matters involving cryptocurrency. I think the enforcement staff will also focus on disclosures relating to ESG, given that they have announced that the enforcement division has a task force on ESG. And another area of concern for advisory clients is the transparencies of fee structures around their accounts, particularly in wrap programs. I think in this area, they'll be looking at disclosures around trading activities in particular. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Laura to talk about some other enforcement initiatives.
So in the area of cybersecurity, the enforcement staff is conducting an investigation related to last year's SolarWinds cyber attack. The staff sent letters to entities, including advisors, that it believed may have been victims of that attack, requesting that they provide information on a voluntary basis regarding the extent to which they were affected and their responses to the attack in exchange for amnesty from potential SEC enforcement proceedings. In that same request, the staff also sought information on other cyber attacks unrelated to SolarWinds and whether those attacks were or should have been disclosed, but notably, they did not offer amnesty for self-reporting those incidents. We held a briefing call for IAA members on this initiative and key considerations for investment advisors, some of which are the need for vigilance in IT security, how to respond to these types of cyber requests, whether to get information from your vendors on their exposure to the SolarWinds compromise, informing fund boards, and any need to inform your insurance carriers under the terms of cyber coverage. And very recently, just this month, the enforcement staff brought cases against victims of account takeovers. This involves cloud-based email accounts that were taken over by unauthorized third parties, and personally identifiable information of thousands of clients were exposed as a result. None of the email accounts were protected in accordance with the firm's policies. In addition, one of the advisors sent breach notifications to clients that included allegedly misleading language, suggesting that the notifications were issued sooner than they actually were after discovery of the incidents. Another common theme in these cases is that once a firm discovered an email account takeover, it failed to adopt and implement written policies and procedures requiring firm-wide enhanced security measures, in particular multi-factor authentication for cloud-based email accounts, until many months or even years after the fact. As the chief of the SEC Enforcement Division Cyber Unit said, it's not enough to write a policy requiring enhanced security measures if those requirements are not implemented or are only partially implemented, especially in the face of known attacks. In addition to the Division of Enforcement, the SEC Division of Examinations continues to focus on cybersecurity and has put out some guidance, most recently risk alerts on safeguarding client accounts against credential compromise and also ransomware. We do have an IAA cybersecurity and data privacy compliance forum. We have an upcoming call, so encourage you to join. And back to you, Sanjay.
Yeah, so let's switch gears and talk about the examinations program. Just a couple of administrative matters. Last December, the SEC decided to essentially elevate what was formerly referred to as the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations to now the Division of Examinations. From a practical standpoint, this doesn't really change how exams are conducted, but you will hear me accidentally continue to refer to them as OC, so it'll take some time. Also, Pete Driscoll is no longer director of the division. Dan Call is now serving as acting director. A note about Dan is that he used to work in the Division of Investment Management on advisor related issues. So he's quite familiar with our area, our issues. Now, in terms of their pandemic related operations, examiners, like the entire SEC staff, are working remotely, which means no on-site exams. They will, however, come on site if there's an emergency type situation where investors are potentially being financially harmed. But otherwise, they're conducting exams from home. As for focus areas, of course, every year the SEC publishes its examination priorities, usually in the January and February timeframe. This year, it took them a little longer. They published them in March, which is likely due to the fact that there is a change in administration. So I am guessing that the current priorities are reflected to a large degree for the new administration, do reflect the new administration's priorities, which includes a continued emphasis on investments and services that are marketed to retail investors, including seniors and individuals, particularly through mutual funds and exchange traded products. So that continues to be a high priority area. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire list of priorities. I'm guessing by now you've gone through them, but I do want to highlight what I think are sort of the top 3 specific areas that the exam program will focus on under the new leadership, which will probably not surprise you. These include a focus on climate and sustainability related products and services, including ESG, information security, as Laura mentioned, privacy and cybersecurity, as well as operational resiliency, given that most firms are still working under remote operations in response to the pandemic. So I do think they'll take a look at that area. And I do think they'll look at issues relating to fintech and innovation, including digital assets. We've already talked about some of the regulatory priorities that they have. So I think the exam program will be looking at it as well. So now I'm going to actually turn it over to Monique to talk about some of the risk alerts that the exam program has put out in more detail. Monique?
Yeah, the first risk alert we want to talk about is the RAP fee programs. This alert described findings from over 100 exams of advisors that served as portfolio managers and sponsors of RAP fee programs, or they recommended clients invest in third-party RAP fee programs. The staff found deficiencies around fiduciary duty, disclosure, and policies and procedures. And they found that advisors were not fulfilling their fiduciary duty because they did not have a reasonable basis to believe that the RAP fee programs were in the best interest of clients initially and on an ongoing basis. The staff also found that advisors did not monitor trading away from brokers providing the bundled brokerage services and did not monitor the frequency of trading, which resulted in higher fees than in non-RAP fee accounts. And we mentioned this earlier on the call. Firms didn't provide full and fair disclosure of all material facts relating to fees, expenses, specific conflicts of interest, and relationships with other parties involved in the program. And compliance policies and procedures were found to be ineffective because they didn't adequately address these requirements: best interest reviews, due diligence on managers, best X, and trading away practices, and testing. And the staff found instead that firms were following internal guidelines or informal practices for these key operational areas. Next, I'll highlight a risk alert on fixed income, principal, and cross trades. It supplements a 2019 alert in this area, and almost 2/3 of the examined advisors received a deficiency letter, most relating to 3 areas: adequacy of compliance programs, conflicts of interest, and disclosures. Not surprising. The staff found that cross trades were not executed at independent market prices, contrary to the advisor's policies and procedures, or did not receive best price or best execution. The staff also found conflicts with cross trades that were not identified, mitigated, disclosed, or otherwise addressed by compliance programs. And deficiencies in disclosure included lack of full and fair disclosure of all material facts around the trades, including the nature and significance of the conflicts as they related to impacted clients. The SEC also included a lot of helpful industry practices in both alerts and identified effective or good compliance policies and procedures, which is a really great trend that we're seeing out of the Division of Examinations to help registered advisors. These alerts are really key to helping identify potential gaps between your practices and the SEC's staff observations around effective compliance obligations. So shifting gears from the risk alerts to some general advisor concerns. Everything we've discussed so far is in line with the results we're seeing from our annual compliance testing survey that IAA conducts together with ACA Compliance Group and UTR Compliance Consulting. The 350 survey participants across all firm size and types ranked implementation of the new marketing rule as the top compliance concern, as Sanjay mentioned, with cybersecurity, climate change, and ESG, COVID-related BCPs, and digital assets rounding out the top 5. Probably not a surprise. We'll be focusing on both marketing implementation and ESG compliance programs in our compliance workshops in November, doing a hands-on day on each topic. We've talked a lot about the SEC today, but it's definitely not the only agency that's been busy. Sarah will talk about the DOL, and I will talk about the Federal Trade Commission. We're engaged at the CFTC as well, but won't get into detail on that agency here, except to say that President Biden has named nominees to fill some of the open CFTC seats, including nominating acting chair Ross Benham to step into the role formally. And we do have a CFTC committee, so please let me know if you're interested in CFTC issues. Sarah?
Thanks, Monique. So at the DOL, let's start with the fiduciary exemption. As a follow-up to the fiduciary rule that was vacated, the DOL officially reinstated the 5-part test to determine whether a person is an investment advice fiduciary. And they adopted an exemption to allow advice fiduciaries to receive compensation for providing fiduciary investment advice and to engage in certain principal transactions. This exemption, like the vacated rule, covers only non-discretionary advice. So its primary application for investment advisors providing discretionary management is with respect to advice on rollovers, including rollovers from other firms. The exemption includes a number of requirements, and its effective date was February 16 of this year, but the DOL said that it will extend its temporary enforcement policy from 2018 until December 20th of this year to give firms time to transition to the new requirements. We've held a webinar on the exemption that's on our website. We've also been having member calls. I would say the most frequent issues that I've heard about from members are the challenge in getting retirement plan information from clients so that members can compare the fees and investment options of a client's plan with an IRA, and developing the written disclosure explaining why a rollover is in a client's best interest. And the IAA is working on a letter requesting an extension of at least 6 months to provide members more time to comply with the new requirements. In terms of ESG and proxy voting, that's an area in the previous administration where the DOL was active. They adopted rules in both of those areas. And the IAA objected to both rules and requested that the proposals be withdrawn. The DOL made some changes when they adopted the rules, but we continue to be concerned about the chilling effect of the rules on ESG investing. And we raised those concerns with the DOL staff. And we were really pleased when the DOL issued a statement in March that it intended to visit both rules and would not enforce either rule. On August 6th, the DOL sent to the Office of Management and Budget a proposal titled Prudence and Loyalty in Selecting Plan Investments and Exercising Shareholder Rights. So it looks like they've included ESG and proxy in the same package. Monique?
Turning to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC's regulatory agenda includes a rule proposal from the previous administration that could affect fund managers. Under current requirements, each fund that proposes to acquire voting securities of an issuer aggregated across commonly controlled funds and that exceeds a certain value must file an advance notice with the FTC. And there are filing exemptions for funds that satisfy a passive investor exemption or an institutional investor exemption. Under this proposal, however, funds and advisors would have to change the way that they calculate their ownership of voting securities prior to acquiring them. They would have to aggregate acquisitions in the same issuer across all clients and their affiliates' clients. The IAA strongly opposed this proposal and urged the FTC to withdraw it because it would significantly impair an investor's ability to invest, and by restricting access to the markets during that 30-day waiting period required under the rules, and make it difficult for an advisor to meet its fiduciary duty to its clients. It would also increase costs and burdens significantly. So we're following developments here to see when or how the FTC will move forward with this proposal, and we'll continue to keep members updated on next steps. Gail, let me turn it back to you.
Thanks, Monique. Before I turn it to Karen to wrap up, I'd like to just briefly mention that NASA's proposed model rule on continuing education was formally adopted, and Wisconsin has been the first state to propose continuing education requirements for its IARs. So folks who have IARs should keep an eye on that. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Karen, let me turn it to you.
Thanks, Gail. Just a couple of quick takeaways here. Policy changes up next at the SEC are sustainable investing, both for issuers and asset managers, cyber risk governance, private fund fees and conflicts, digital advice. Those things seem up next. You just heard from Sarah, up next at DOL, fiduciary exemption, ESG and proxy. And you heard from Neil, up next on Capitol Hill, key tax and retirement changes. So there's a lot going on from the policy front. The IAA is actively engaged on all of these issues, and our positions are informed, in fact, driven by the feedback that we get from all of you. Your engagement on telling us what matters most to you and your businesses is what informs our policy positions. Please get involved. In a few slides, you'll see the list of our committees. Please join them. Many of them help drive our policy positions. Please join our Capitol Hill efforts with our Advocacy Day and Take Action Now letters, as Neil mentioned, and more. Your engagement is critically important. Take a seat at the table and have your voice heard. You'll see that we also have the committees listed here. Prior slide, please. Members of our government relations, business practices, and legal teams, and our indeed entire staff are always here to connect with you on any issue. And we continue to offer a wider range of services to help you stay informed and engaged, ranging from our many webinars, our discussion forums, issue-specific calls, and the committees. I also want to remind you that our legal team is here to talk through any issue. I'd also like to encourage all of you to get involved with the IAA. And you'll see here our staff contacts. Call any of us, as I said, anytime with any questions. I want to thank all of you for attending today. I want to thank Gail, Neil, and the entire legal team for a terrific presentation. I hope this was helpful to you, and have a great afternoon.